podcast. This is your host, Andre Joseph of AJ Epics Productions, and we're back with an all new episode. Today, we are going to be talking about action figures based on the 1989 cult classic Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. This film marked the beginnings of the career of one Keanu Reeves, who was pretty much a independent film star from such movies as River's Edge and Permanent Record. And Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure would be the start of Mr. Reeves's long and very interesting career before he would transform into a big time action star with such successes as Speed, the Matrix trilogy, and most recently John Wick and its current trilogy as we speak. And it also starred Alex Winter, who at the time was probably known for films like The Lost Boys and his role as Hermosa in Death Wish 3. And this was a movie that also was I guess, the tail end of the 1980s, cashing in on the success of Back to the Future, but going in its own interesting direction. If we go back to 1989, this was a movie that virtually came out of nowhere. It was actually shot 2 years prior through Dino De Laurentiis' production company, which went bankrupt in 1987. And the movie was basically shelved for 2 years before Orion Pictures picked it up. And essentially, they dumped it in release that early part of '89. So there really wasn't a tremendous amount of hype for it. It probably was expected not to do well, but strangely enough, it caught on with the audiences that saw it in the theater and caught on with even more people when it came out on home video that summer. And I happened to be one of those kids back then in the 80s that rented this movie, enjoyed the shit out of it, loved those two characters. For the millennials that don't really know anything about Bill and Ted, this was a film about two teenage slackers from the town of San Dimas, California, who aspire to become the biggest rock stars in the world, but they're held back by their grades, specifically in their history class. If they flunk, then that's it. You have Ted, whose father is a police officer and wants him to go to military school. You have Bill, whose dad is dating a girl that's virtually his own teenage age, and likely he may end up nowhere. He could end up be working in a fast food joint. What these two teenagers don't realize, however, is that in the future, their music is supposed to bring peace to the world, and because of their dilemma with their history class, a if they don't pass it, essentially this future is not going to happen. So they go and they send Rufus, played by the late great George Carlin, who comes to their present time to let them know that this is what they have to do. They have to pass this class or else their future is going to not exist. And they are left with a time traveling phone booth that lets them go through time. And originally their plan was to meet with these historical figures for their history report, but in essence they end up actually taking those historical figures and traveling all of them back into their time. Billy the Kid, Abraham Lincoln, Joan of Arc, Genghis Khan, and the list goes on. And they're all brought back for this big grand finale of their concert-like history report in high school. That, in a nutshell, is Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and it caught on, as I said, in 1989 with teenagers, with young kids, and this turned into a franchise right away. So you had a series of video games that came out for the Nintendo and on the PC. You had a number of cartoons and a live action television series that did not have Alex Winter and Keanu Reeves. And there was also the sequel, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, which went into a completely different direction. They're trying to compete in the Battle of the Bands event. And we start to learn a little bit more about their future, that there is an opposition threat. This character, Diaminos, played by Joss Ackland from Lethal Weapon 2, who hates what society has become, and he creates robot clones of Bill and Ted to be sent back in time to kill the original Bill and Ted. And they do that successfully with the idea that they kill them, ruin their lives, and this peaceful future is not going to happen. And Bill and Ted end up in hell and face their fears, face their nightmares, and in order to get back to life, they have to face the Grim Reaper in a series of board games and Twister. Completely different film, and I remember because I was such a huge fan at that point, I actually saw Bogus Journey over Terminator 2 in the summer of '91, and that is probably one of the biggest regrets of my life. Not that the film is bad, I actually still enjoy Bogus Journey, but clearly Terminator 2 was the classic, and I regret not seeing that in the theaters. So forgive me, Arnold Schwarzenegger, for that. So, what we're talking about today is, believe it or not, the action figure toy line that was spawned off from the two movies. And Kenner, which was obviously very infamous for a number of movie licensed toy lines, decided to take, of all things, this film, which really was, not exactly an action movie, not exactly a comic book based movie, but just like a sci fi comedy in the vein of Back to the Future and other 80s comedies. And they kind of went in this weird direction where they weren't going to have like action moves. They were actually going to be like this musical component to the toy line. So that's where we begin. So the action figure assortment for Bill and Ted, I remember seeing these in KB Toys back in '91. This must have been a couple of months after Bogus Journey came out. Most of these figures were probably a little bit bigger than the Batman toys in inches. They all came with instruments, musical instruments, of course, and they also actually captured the likeness of the characters pretty well. But it was sort of like the figures were a little bit of a weird hybrid between the film counterparts as well as the animated series versions of Bill and Ted. So, in talking about the main characters, Bill S. Preston Esquire and Ted Theodore Logan, they both have their actual outfits from the original Bill and Ted movie. Both are pretty much to the likeness of Alex Winter and Keanu Reeves. But like I said, they have more of the cartoon look, which was inspired by their actual look from the films. And both of them have the poses of holding guitars, because of course they're both guitarists in the films. And when you squeeze their legs, they would actually start to strum on those guitars. So that was in a nutshell what those figures were. They just they would jam out, their heads could spin, they rock out, and that was that. But there's a little bit more to it. Like I said, there's a musical component which I'll get to in a second. You also had an action figure of George Carlin's Rufus character who came with keyboards. I don't think he ever played keyboards in any of the films, but nonetheless, this was actually a really cool action figure. The only action figure of existence of the late great George Carlin, and it captures him perfectly. The pink suit, the famous Geordie LaForge style sunglasses. I mean, it's him. It clearly is Rufus. And then you have some of the historical figures from the original Bill and Ted movie. You have Abraham Lincoln, and that's a weird one because he's got that top hat, he's got, the Abraham Lincoln look, but he comes with like a neon yellow keyboard, and when you take his hat off, he has a flat top with the WYLD Stallyns logo on it. Again, they were, if you remember the original Bill and Ted, all of these historical figures would quickly adapt to late 1980s America, and suddenly, they would kind of get a little more hip and cool, and it just, yeah, I mean, it's a comedy, so it's what you would have to expect if you're dealing with historical figures in that type of setting. It's all for entertainment value, people. There was a Genghis Khan action figure, which came with the staff. Looks a little different from the Genghis Khan in the film, but the same thing. he probably has more of a battle action look than the rest of the toy line in this thing. You know, you could probably even use it for like a Conan the Barbarian type of line, because you would actually have this figure and not even know it has anything to do with Bill and Ted. So he's probably like the one that seems a little bit out of place. There was a Billy the Kid action figure, which also came with a guitar. Surprisingly enough, because I collected these figures when they came out, but I never saw Billy the Kid in the store, and I only realized that he existed recently in my research. Not much to say here. I mean, he looks kind of like the Billy the Kid from the film. That's all I got to say about that. And like I said, a lot of these figures, like the Rufus and the Abe Lincoln toys, have the same poses playing the keyboards. The Billy the Kid has a similar pose to Bill and Ted with the guitar strumming. So there's really, I mean, Genghis Khan is the only one that seems to be out of place with the rest of them because he has more of an action pose, whereas everybody else is posing like they're playing instruments. The most bizarre figure in the line, maybe even more bizarre than Genghis Khan, is the Grim Reaper. Now, this is supposed to be the Grim Reaper from Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, who was played by William Sadler. And by the way, that performance was supposed to be a comedic homage to Ingmar Bergman's The 39 Steps. If you recall, the Grim Reaper is in that, and they were kind of making fun of that movie. But this Grim Reaper doesn't look anything like William Sadler, doesn't look anything like the Grim Reaper from Bogus Journey. Instead, maybe because maybe the Grim Reaper in the movie was just too creepy for kids to be an action figure, they decided to make a Grim Reaper toy that looks like a reject from Ghostbusters. This one has a blue mohawk, it's skeletal, it's wearing like this weird bow tie suit under its cloth, and it has a neon green skeleton guitar, and it has a Grim Reaper staff, which is also in neon green. So yeah, I mean, if this was supposed to be the one from Bogus Journey, this fails completely. At the same time, if you remember, the Grim Reaper was supposed to, become a ally to Bill and Ted. So, I think they were trying to play that up a little bit more in the toy line. As far as I know, he was not in the cartoon series. He was in the Marvel Comics adaptation. If you remember, Marvel had done a series of Bill and Ted comic books that took place after the events of Bogus Journey. They were actually pretty good. And the Grim Reaper was a big part of the continuing storyline of that particular picture. And yeah, so that was that. And then there were a couple of little extras to the line. There was, of course, the Bill and Ted phone booth from the movie. Clearly, this is pretty much a cool little playset here. If you want to call it a playset, it's more like just a mini, thing. But this one has, like the phone booth, the doors could open. It has this yellow antenna that you could pull up. There's a phone receiver inside, and yeah, you could press the top of a button on the booth, the line would snap back, and drag the figure into the booth, and then the line would snap back on the antenna, and the booth would spin. A little bit of features to it. It was trying to capture the feel of the film in a way that the phone booth could spin and you know get sucked down into the ground. This doesn't suck down to the ground like in the movie, but nonetheless, it is what it is. It's the time traveling phone booth, and thankfully we were able to get that. And then you had some interesting stuff here. You had a Wild Stallions Jam Session 2-pack. So this is the Bill and Ted figures again, but now they're dressed in tuxedos with, summer shorts. These were not released publicly, and they were sent to smaller distributors and sellers. So these toys, there's nothing really all that great about them. It's just like different variants of Bill and Ted, different colored guitars, and slightly different poses. But basically, it's just the same figures, just with the different body mold. And then one thing, and I said before about the music component, this line had what they would call a speaker and tape set. So each of the Bill and Ted action figures had a place on the back where an audio line could be plugged in. By plugging in the figures to a cassette playing using this item, the characters could be made to play music with their legs when their legs were squeezed together. Music on the cassette was all Bill and Ted unrelated instrumentals with such titles as the Rufus Riff, the Rhythm Guitar, Lead Guitar, Accidental Chord, etc. So the idea being that you could play this music and have this little toy speaker plugged into the toy, so when you would actually squeeze the figures, they could actually play along to the music. Now, interestingly enough, this only worked with Bill, Ted, and Rufus as far as the action figures go. It did not work well with any of the other toys that were in the line. And I had this, and I think I used it maybe 1 or 2 times before I put it aside because I just didn't understand how it worked. Mind you, I was 8 years old, so, I was very not so tech savvy back in those days to figure this kind of stuff out. But nonetheless, it was supposed to be this cool little gimmick to show that, hey, you could also play music with these guys because they're rockers, and that's pretty much what Bill and Ted was supposed to be about. These two rockers whose music saves the world. And probably to no surprise, I mean, granted, Bogus Journey did reasonably well, and Bill and Ted was very popular, but the toys just did not fly off the shelves. You got to keep in mind, these were not action figures in the sense of a Batman or Ghostbusters or anything that had, like, villains and play sets and so forth. So kids really were not going to play around with a bunch of toys that were playing music if they could play music themselves. If anything, they would want to role play as Bill and Ted. And they were not violent. Even when you play the video games, most of the premises involve Bill and Ted just trying to find these historical figures and put them in the phone booth. So you really weren't like having to face off on too many villains, and even if you did, there really wasn't a whole lot you could do other than to run away from them. So there really wasn't so much to go on with these toys. It was just kind of like, okay, they're there, they're cool to have, but then, you kind of get bored very quickly and kind of realize that. But as it turned out, there were plans for a lot more figures that were supposed to be in this line that never came out. Apparently, there was a Napoleon action figure that was planned and not released. And if you remember, Napoleon was like one of the first historical figures that they came across in the original Bill and Ted, and he's the one that accidentally gets into the phone booth and is left behind while Bill and Ted go off into the different time zones. And Napoleon is pretty much in the care of Ted's siblings, who, remember like the scene in the bowling alley and when they take him to take ice cream. Cool figure to have. It had like a drum kit that it was supposed to come with. Actually, the Genghis Khan also had the same drum kit as a playset. I mean, as an accessory. But Napoleon, yeah, that was one that we were unfortunately not getting beyond the prototype phase. And then there were also a whole lot of play sets that we just never got, and even vehicles. So, in addition to the phone booth, which we did get, thank God, we were also supposed to get a motorcycle setup called the Most Excellent Motorcycle Vehicle. So it was really 3 vehicles in one for Bill and Ted to ride with, and they would have twin seats, so you could have like a third person in the middle of these 2 bikes. And yeah, they could fit anybody, and all 3 vehicles could work separately. They could even pull apart. So we never got that, and they never rode motorcycles in the movies, so, it was just another one of those things that and it's always weird too with the hand poses for Bill and Ted, that they couldn't exactly be posed well to hold the handlebars. So that was a little, I would say, a little odd and frustrating way to even have a vehicles period with the way that their hands were. It wasn't like they had like swift evil arms that could move around and pose so easily. One that I think is a little controversial in terms of prototype playsets was the Talking Cruiser. So this was a Pontiac Trans Am in this sort of dye painted white and purple and pink coloring. And the thing was, this vehicle is supposed to be for Bill and Ted to drive around, and the car could talk, just like Kit from Knight Rider. Ironically enough, Kenner had produced a Knight Rider action figure, which I do have, and this was the Talking Kit toy from 1982. And surprisingly enough, Kenner was planning to recycle that actual Kit Knight Rider car for Bill and Ted. We never got that, but nonetheless, if you've seen the pictures, it's pretty much the Kit vehicle. And I actually just showed this recently because I was actually shocked that this actually was going to exist. And there was also a second vehicle that was planned, the boom truck vehicle, which looks like an East LA lowrider. So this was like I guess a half pickup truck kind of deal. You could stage like a little mini concert with Bill and Ted in the back seat, and have the stereo set up if you wanted to play the music. So yeah, you could play the music from the back of the truck. There's a connected speaker to it. So yeah, it was just like this little cool idea to combine the music component with an actual vehicle in the Bill and Ted line. Didn't get this one, even though it looks kind of cool from the pictures that I see. And yes, there was one playset that was planned, and this was called the historical playset. So if you remember, we talked about the Batcave playset from the Batman line, how it would fold out with the front of the building to like the inside of like what's supposed to be Bruce Wayne's hallway, and then flip the other side of it, you're inside the Batcave. This was the similar setup even before that ever came out. Actually, no, it was around that time because that was part of the Dark Knight collection. But the historical playset was supposed to be 3 playsets in one. So, like, the idea of the characters time traveling, this is what this setup was supposed to be. So, like, on one side, it would be the WYLD Stallyns garage where they would jam and rehearse their music. Flip to the other side, you have the castle set up. If you remember in the original film, when they go to medieval times and they meet with the 2 princess babes that ultimately become their wives, that's one side of it. Then another side is supposed to be like an 1800 saloon where they meet Billy the Kid's got a breakaway window. And I think there's another side of it that looks kind of like, I guess, supposed to be like an extension of the castle. I think it's supposed to be like a dungeon type of setup from the reverse side of the WYLD Stallyns garage. And then like there's a slide, then there's supposed to be like a San Dimas Mall sign. This is kind of like very eclectic, very kind of funky looking, and maybe so much going on here that I could see why it didn't come out. I think it just would have been too complicated of a place set to set up, so it's just one of those things. I mean, an excuse to play with the time traveling aspect of it, but it was just a little too wild to have to set up and put together, and all the stickers and accessories to it. So this really never came out. At least when you had the Batcave, it was more concise, and you knew it was playing up the dual identity of Bruce Wayne and Batman. So clearly I could see why this never came out. And in a nutshell, that was Bill and Ted. That was all we got because, like I said, this was just a toy line that never really caught on. And even though it was eye-popping and appealing to pick up in the store, after a while, there really wasn't long-term value unless you want to use that Keanu Reeves figure and start reenacting scenes from Speed or Chain Reaction. But that's as good as it would get. And like I said, I still actually have some of these figures. I think some of the accessories are probably long missing. And the phone booth, I know, has some root beer stains on it. Long story. But that was that. I mean, it was just really not much else. There were no figures for Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. Nothing further from the cartoons. No Joan of Arc. None of that stuff. So there really isn't too much else to say about Bill and Ted, which is why it's going to be such a short episode today. But as always, I like to leave off with some good news, because after a long delay and a long time where we thought it would never exist, we are finally going to be getting the third Bill and Ted movie in the summer of 2020. The premise being that both of the boys are now in their 50s, have not done that one song that's going to change the world, and essentially everybody's pretty much abandoned them. And now there's one more opportunity to potentially find a way to get that music going, and it may require them going back to the original movie and running into their younger selves, as well as Rufus, who will likely be recreated in CGI, just like Grand Moff Tarkin in Rogue One. So you have not seen the last of George Carlin as Rufus, just not in living physical form, but he will be present in this movie. And Keanu Reeves is back, Alex Winter is back. I just heard William Sadler's coming back as the Grim Reaper. So this is happening. I can't wait to see it. I think if there are going to be action figures for it, they're probably going to be specialized NECA dolls, or Diamond Selects will probably take this up. Maybe even make vintage toys of them in doll form. So we'll see what happens with that. But in a nutshell, that's all I could really say about Bill and Ted. It just was a good idea because it was such a interesting little franchise, but a toy line that really just didn't call for it. But I mean, I'm still glad that we got it nonetheless, or else we probably would be wishing that we did. And to leave off, so as always, to talk about the figures that we wish we would have had as kids, that we wish were produced back in those days, I'd say for this particular line, obviously, I would have loved to have seen more of the toys from Bogus Journey to come out. The stations, if you remember, like the little caveman-looking creatures that they would team up with, I would have liked to see those. I would have liked to have seen the Radio Shack made Bill and Ted robots, the good guy Bill and Ted robots would have been kind of cool. More of the historical figures from the first movie, like Socrates, Joan of Arc, and I guess Sigmund Freud would have been kind of cool. Although it would have been a weird figure to have. That's all I could say. There really isn't too much else. And that's Bill and Ted. So, I look forward to the next movie. The toy line, as I said, it was just nice to have, but not exactly, something that I feel had really long-term value. So that's it for the Silver Screen Action Figure Podcast today. You could always follow us on Facebook, and you can follow us on Twitter at SilverScreenAF1. And as always, if you have questions, comments, or if you even want to make suggestions for future episodes, email us at silverscreenafpodcast@gmail.com. And as Bill and Ted would say, party on, dudes!